excitement. Humor. Very little humor is what I'm going to share today. Terrible riddles. How do you catch a unique rabbit? You sneak up on it. How do you catch a tame rabbit? Tame way. You sneak up on it. How do crazy people go through the forest? They take a psychopath. What lies at the bottom of the ocean and twitches? A nervous wreck. Where do you find a dog with no legs? Right where you left them. Why don't blind people skydive? It scares the dog. I like that one. How is a Texas tornado and an Alabama divorce the same? Somebody's going to lose a trailer. Some of you are frowning because you don't want to smile at that. I'm going to just go through these verses that we read this morning, just one at a time, and sort of take them apart and look at them, because I believe it's fairly important as Jesus is going through these discourses and what he is telling us. The very first one we get to is Jesus is dealing with all these scribes and Pharisees that are trying to trap him. And in the middle of it, this guy comes up and asks a very honest question. And he probably had enough of the teaching from the synagogues around him and have found them not really sufficient. So he asks this question: what is the most important commandment? Now, you'd expect somebody who has like 800 kids, the same answer they would give is, which one is your favorite? I love them all the same. No, this is not that question that Jesus answered. 613 laws. How do you pick one? Jesus didn't have any problems. I, the Lord your God, am one Lord. Love me with all your heart, mind, body, soul, and strength. And the second one, which is part of the first, and love your neighbor as yourself. Pretty simple. Love God, love each other. Love God, love each other. And if you do that, you complete the whole law. How come we make it so hard to walk with Jesus? I love the response of this guy. He says, you know what? This is more important than all the feasts and all the ceremonies and all the things that go on in the temple. All that stuff that people have made important throughout the years, this doesn't come close to those two ways that God gave us, those two commandments: love God and love each other. Yet we have churches that are built on everything but loving God and loving each other. You have to do it this way. You have to walk this way. You have to dress this way. You have to speak this way. You have got to fall in line if you want to be considered part of us. Really. Really, 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 really. I have found that most people are turned off not by Jesus, but by those who claim to follow Jesus, because they make so many rules and regulations that it sort of chases people away. Rather than being fishers of men, they've become keepers of the gate. I don't know if you've ever been in a church where you have certain people that are sort of the guards of the kingdom. I don't know if we're going to let everybody in. One church was growing in Oregon, and the churches around basically called it a garbage dump, because they take all the garbage from all the other churches that nobody else wants, and they're bragging about growing. The pastor mentioned this at his board meeting, and someone says, you know that park on the north side of town? And he goes, yeah. He says, it was a landfill. That when it was done, they fixed it up and they made it into a park that now families can use. He says, isn't that what we're doing? We're taking people that have their faults and their struggles, and we're allowing Jesus to remake them. Love God, love each other. Do you think God would have to tell us to love each other if each other was lovable? No, he wouldn't. So what he's really saying there is love people who are unlovable to a certain extent, because that's what you're supposed to do. That's how we move people into the kingdom. Fair enough?
You can love the sinner.
We're all sinners. Exactly. We all have. I have a book on my shelf that I bought it because of the title, and it says this: everybody's normal till you get to know them. That's the call. We wouldn't be called to love people if they were naturally lovable. That's why God tells us to love people, because sometimes we can get sort of cranky. Did you ever see that commercial about car insurance? I think it's National, where the guy says, I got in an accident, and I called up my insurance agent, and he forgave me of that accident. And he looks at his wife and he says, do you notice that some people are into forgiving people? And she gave him sort of a dirty look, give you forgiveness. But that's exactly what God is calling us to do. Love is not an option. Does that mean people walk all over us? No. Letting someone walk all over you is not a loving thing to do. If your kid's in trouble, the best thing to do is correct him, rather than go, oh, Junior, it's okay. You know what I'm saying? Love is doing what's best for someone else. Then there's an interesting thing that happens right at the end, and you'll miss it. Because the guy compliments Jesus on this, and Jesus goes, you know what? You're not far from the kingdom. Now, listen to what he is saying. You have found Jesus, you have asked Jesus a question, you have complimented Jesus on his answer. As in, I think like you do, Jesus. And Jesus doesn't say you are in the kingdom. He says you are not far from the kingdom. You mean if you don't think right, you're not in the kingdom? It has nothing to do with thinking the kingdom. What does the kingdom have to do with it? Relationship. You can have all the right thoughts in the world, and that doesn't matter. There comes a time in your life where you have to invite Jesus to be a part of your life, and you have to connect with him. Being a good person is not the goal of Christianity. It's a fruit of Christianity, because if you walk with Jesus, there is going to be good fruit produced. But that is not the goal of Christianity. The goal of Christianity is our connection to Christ. We can talk like Him, we can think like Him, we can do Jesus-like things, but that will not replace the connection. Jesus isn't living within your heart. You've just rolled snake eyes. No matter how good you think you are, we need Christ. It's the connection that counts. Amen? Everybody's sort of looking at me like, well, that's harsh. It's what it is. So then we get into the second part. And I sort of like this, because it goes into this whole thing where Jesus is sort of talking to these teachers. And he goes, how can David be the father of the Lord, and yet the Lord is David's Lord? Do you know what I'm saying? How can he be David's offspring, yet his Lord? Explain that one to me. You got an explanation? Let me give you mine. He's God, he can do whatever he wants. Fair enough? Can Jesus go somewhere and stay someplace at the same time? Can he sit at the right hand of God, yet reside in our hearts? Yes. But what happens is you have all these Pharisees wanting to be smarter, these scribes wanting to be better than everybody else. And Jesus just goes to show, don't think that it is your wisdom or your ability that makes you special. It's God within you. And in fact, he warns them about the Pharisees and the scribes, saying, these people have taken the truths of God and twisted them so that they can eat widows' for money and the fortune of other people, and that they can chew them up and spit them out and leave them behind. Be watchful of these spiritual charlatans. Anybody remember, it hasn't been more than a couple of months, where the guy needed a $54 million jet? Anybody see that? Jesse Duplantis, I need a $54 million jet. You know why? My other 3 jets I have to refuel. And that gets expensive. So if you get me this $54 million jet, I can be anywhere in 24 hours. First of all, why does he need to get anywhere? What's he going to do? He's just a person, just like you and I, isn't he? Does God make special people and then other people? What does he look for? Someone who will walk with him. Correct? Don't forget, when you go to a hospital room, your prayers are as valuable as mine. When you are dealing with someone who is sick or someone who is in need, God hears your voice as clearly as he hears mine. This idea that there are levels of Christians in this world is just silly. George, when Jesus died on the cross, you were as much on his mind as I was. Does that make sense? See, here's what happens. You get these hierarchies developed in the kingdom, and what you lose is Jesus. Because Vernon here will think, well, I'm just some guy, and God doesn't know who I am from Adam, yada, yada, yada. But when you find out, all of a sudden, later in life, that he speaks to you as well as he speaks to anybody else. When you pick up your Bible, you're going, oh my goodness, this stuff makes sense now. Because all of a sudden you realize you are as important to him as anybody else. Your whole life changes. Your attitude changes. You become somebody. And God can begin to deal with not only you, but every one of your relationships. And you're no longer walking around with this cloud over your head. That's Christianity. You see, and this whole section of Scripture is not to put the Pharisees and the scribes in their place as much as it is to bring everybody else up into that connection with Christ. Because what does this story end with? It starts with the question, it goes with the scribes, and then it ends with this widow. This widow gets in line because they have this long line for the offering that they are taking. And people are taking fanfare type statements of, look at this, and dumping a bag of gold into the thing going, you see what I gave? The royal wave? Do you see me? I'm more loving of God than you are. And all of a sudden, this widow comes up and throws in 2 mites, copper coins, worth a lot less than 10. All she had. And Jesus is sitting across the way, and he says, you see that widow right there? She has given more than everyone else because she gave out of her need, and they gave out of their excess. Heaven smiles on her. I love this story. My wife reminded me the other day that we're never going to be rich. Yeah. I'm okay with that. As long as I'm faithful. Here's the point. We can't all be the rich folks. But then again, we don't want to be. But we can all be that widow whom Jesus looks at and says, wow, she's something. This is our opportunity. We may never end hunger in Africa, but we can make sure a little kid down the street gets enough food to go through the weekend. God doesn't expect us to do everything. He just expects us to walk with Him. To put our 2 mites in that basket and say, okay, Jesus, I'll walk with you. And And that is where we gain our victory. We may lose a job, but guess what? Right around the corner, God finds us a job, doesn't He? With better insurance, too. We may have a hole in our foot, but somehow God will fix that hole eventually. Not as quick as we want. God gives us opportunities to minister and move in His life and to make a difference in our world, doesn't He, Sharon? And we just take those times, the little we can do, and say, okay, Jesus, you use us. And what happens is as we go forward in this life, we see wonderful things happen. Little by little, bit by bit, our lives change. And that's the Christian life. It's not the big cabals. It's not the huge stages. It's not the 100,000 seat auditoriums. It's one person, one heart, one at a time. And we get hope. And despair leaves. Frustration goes. And all of a sudden our world gets put back together. That's how my Jesus works. Not too bad, is it? Here's the promise. Jesus says, you give me your life, I'll show up at the end of the day. Trust me, and I won't let you down. It's a promise. No matter where you come from, no matter what you've done, you show up, you give your life to me, and I'll make it work. Amen? Stand with me, please. Let's sing this song with Karen.